roots of psychiatry have to do with control, power, and alienation from certain groups of people who were uncomfortable to be around. They were locked up in these places to get them out of the way. The history of psychiatry, I think, really is related to institutions.
伦敦的皇家伯利恒医院曾是世界上第一个精神收容所，这里人称疯狂院。这个医院不比仓库大多少，收容那些被认为是疯子的人。精神病患被囚禁在牢笼、小房间和受篮中，用链锁在墙上遭受鞭打，而收容所收取费用供大众参观。18世纪，威廉贝提是第一个宣传他的收容所可以治疗有心理疾病的人。虽然贝提的治疗方式完全跟疯狂院一样不人道，而且没有治好任何人，但是他的疯人院让他成为英国首富之一。他在财务上的成功，造成精神病院这个行业的兴盛，并且给精神科医师机会用这个新兴工业赚钱。
This was an era where, on both sides of the Atlantic, specialized institutions for the mentally ill are beginning to be built in large numbers. Those institutions date back certainly to the beginning of the 18th century, and in a few cases even earlier than that. But the explosive growth of an asylum sector, of asylumdom, as some historians have called it, is very much a 19th century phenomenon. It's that period when the state is persuaded to invest tax dollars in building these places.
尽管经营精神病院的人变得富有，然而精神科医师却缺乏可信度，无法让现金流动达到最大值。
In order to justify their profession, they needed to come up with these biological solutions, or they didn't have any profession. The only way for them to solve that was to attempt to start believing that these people that were suffering from emotional disorders was from a biological basis.
Whatever was done to make this person more manageable would be simply called a treatment. And the sad reality is that many of these so-called treatments were, in essence, torture.
The near-drowning devices that were developed in this period, for example, must have been appallingly frightening. For example, one device involved putting the patient into a coffin, closing the lid, and dumping it into a bath of water, and then opening it up and trying to revive the patient. There were a range of these things, and the mortality rate was very, very high.
精神科医师接着用医学术语来包装他们的行为，来产生可信度。这种治疗方法的重新包装成了所谓的医疗模式。
Somebody who's really hyper and manic, if you're wrapped up in a cold sheet and dunked into some water, you're going to quit acting manic because that's a punishing treatment. But as soon as the symptoms started to go away, they started to believe that somehow by wrapping them up and dunking them in cold water, it was draining the toxics out of their body. So they built the medical model around that.
一位名叫班杰明·拉许的美国人，把心理疾病的生物理论更进一步延伸。他提出，非理性是由于头部血液过多。治疗方式以一切方法排除血液。监禁、冷水、放血，甚至惊吓。因此，新的医疗模式诞生了。
Benjamin Rush was probably the most famous American physician of the Revolutionary era. Rush was known as the master bleeder. He bled his patients for madness. He also invented something called the tranquilizer. It's a chair that looks a little bit like an electric chair. The patient was confined in this apparatus, sometimes with cold water applied to his or her head, for some hours at a time, and Rush announces in a letter that he's invented this new contraption and dubbed it the tranquilizer.
拉许经常致死的程序全部详载在他1812年的教科书当中。之后70年，这本书仍被奉为精神病学的权威。他极受尊重，在1965年被正式奉为美国精神病学之父，放在美国精神病学协会的印记上。 随着19世纪的推移，精神病学上的治疗疯狂，造成越来越多的失败，威胁到财务状况，迫使他们发明新的医疗模式。
The cures promised were not delivered. So by the 1860s and 70s, a growing mood of pessimism was covering Europe and North America, that effectively the new institutions were ever growing in size but not growing in their effectiveness.
20世纪出现更多的医疗模式。美国精神病学家亨利·卡顿切除病人的身体部分，使病人残废，并宣称这是治疗心理疾病的一大突破。
The earliest target was the teeth and then the tonsils and the sinuses. But when patients didn't get better, the enthusiasts for this treatment then started to move down the body and to say, well, obviously patients have swallowed bacteria in their saliva, so stomachs need to go, spleens need to go, colons need to go.
由于大众对于病人受到虐待及伤残的抗议之声快速增长，精神科医师不断发明新的方法，个个都称为神奇疗法，但最后都证明一个比一个没用，而且更加残忍。
This is a history of psychiatry, more or less, to damage the patient. I mean, this is a version of the original model, which was to chain them like animals.
If you're doing it to somebody because you insist that they have to change, and you're going to do that by turning the screws, you might say, whether it's with medication, restraint, whatever, that's torture. And a huge part of what psychiatry has done really comes down to torture.
20世纪向前推进，精神病学借由转变成一门医疗学科，继续寻求自身的正当性。但是他们只成功地创造了更多有效方法，带来精神与肉体的折磨与死亡。现代精神病学承袭了这项遗产。加上目前最有利润的医疗模式，用药大量毒害数百万人。但是想要达此目标，精神科医师首先必须打破人类最珍贵的信念，判定人不是大家所想象的那样。